So we talked a little bit about sustainability indicators, and what I want to spend a few minutes talking about really is where these things come from, right, and some of the key considerations in developing a sustainable development indicator. Excuse me. In general, there's two broad approaches to creating indicators. One is that you can use indicators developed and tested by others, and there's all kinds of indicators that are available in the literature to provide a starting point, or at least a reference point in your indicator initiative. So you can do a quick Google search, or you can find long lists of indicators in the academic literature. They're increasingly in textbooks. The second broad approach is that you can develop indicators specifically tailored to the context in which they'll be used. Now, of course, in practice, we often use a combination of these two approaches, right? So if you're going through the effort to develop indicators tailored to your particular context, you'd certainly want to spend some time probably looking at the types of indicators that other entities, particularly in the same sector, have published. Right? Again, there's all kinds of example indicators that are available, so it doesn't matter whether you're developing indicators at the national, the regional, or the organizational level. You probably should be able to uncover some example indicators to at least again serve as a reference point. In terms of tailoring indicators specifically to your context, it is important to note that there is no universally applicable methodology for developing indicators, but there are a number of different guidelines available. And what I want to do is spend a few minutes just talking about one such set of guidelines, just to give us a sense for some of the key things we need to think about when developing sustainable development indicators. And certainly this isn't meant to be comprehensive. We're just going to hit on a couple of the big ones, a couple of the key things that we need to think about. And one of the reasons why I want to focus more on this, I guess, this second broad approach on tailoring indicators specific to your context is that, first of all, that's probably usually going to be the way that you're going to do it. But secondly, going through some of these key steps helps us see, some of the process steps that may not have been immediately apparent if you were just to look at a set of indicators on the internet or the Global Reporting Initiative or some other list of indicators that may be out there. So anyway, you can see that I've got a fairly generic process for developing sustainable development indicators on the screen here. I'm not going to hit on all of these steps. We don't have the time to do that. Instead, I'm going to focus on the one that's highlighted in blue and just some of the key things we need to think about in terms of developing a draft system of indicators. That said, there certainly are, again, considerations that we're not going to hit on in too much detail here today. Certainly, you'd want to begin an indicator assessment with a needs assessment or something somewhat similar, right, just to see the information and data that you have available, identify the key gaps in that, and see what types of information people feel that they need, right, the types of information that people are asking for. You probably want to do some sort of process planning, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to identify every single step in your effort to develop sustainable development indicators, but rather that you get broad agreement on the process, and also that you think about who are the people that you need to involve, right? You're probably going to want to involve stakeholders. The question is, to what extent are stakeholders going to be involved? Where do you want to involve them, and questions of that nature. Once you actually have a draft system of indicators, there's a number of different steps that you want to follow up on, right? Simply developing a draft system of indicators isn't going to necessarily end the process. There may be some testing and adjusting that's necessary. One of the things that's fairly common in indicator development initiatives is that the initial list winds up a little bloated, right? You get into the process of developing indicators and everybody's excited, and before you know it, you've got 150 indicators, right? And one thing that you need to do is probably take a step back and think, okay, do we need all of these indicators? Are we actually going to use all of these? And that's where the testing and adjusting comes in. Certainly implementation is going to be a key step. In some contexts, perhaps the report is the implementation. I generally think that it probably goes beyond that. And you want to, particularly in an organizational context, reporting is only one piece of the implementation process, and you want to make sure that you can build those indicators into the existing business infrastructure wherever it makes sense to do so. And then the last point is just in recognition of the fact that no system of indicators can be fixed in stone, right? You don't want to be changing them constantly. That would make it difficult to do comparisons on a year-over-year basis. But we also need to understand that priorities are going to shift over time, and the system of indicators needs to be capable of accommodating that. And again, there's different ways in which a process like this can be represented, right? We could probably add some steps, maybe change a few of the names here, but it gives us the broad picture, right, of some of the key things we need to think about. And again, what I want to focus on over the next maybe 8 to 10 minutes or so is just talking about some of the key things associated with developing a draft system of indicators, some of the main things that typically we think about when we're trying to develop these things. You can see some of the key steps are listed here. Again, not necessarily meant to be comprehensive. Maybe you could add something else in there, and I probably wouldn't argue with you, depending on what you wanted to add, I guess. But generally, one of the things we need to think about is developing or selecting a conceptual framework. We need to identify key priority issues, right? What are we going to focus these indicators on? Often we develop indicator selection criteria to help bridge the gap from key issues to the development of a draft system of indicators. And then there may be a step on a review, right, where we again take that step back and just think about what we've come up with and whether this is what we want to take forward or not. In terms of a conceptual framework, really to me a conceptual framework is just something to help structure thinking and discussion about a particular issue. Okay, so in terms of sustainable development, you probably need something to help prompt the identification of issues and also to help structure the presentation of those issues and maybe the indicators as well. Okay? A whole bunch of different frameworks are out there in the published literature and have actually been used in practice. These can be classified into a number of different schemes. You can see that I've used one here that was out of a textbook that I used in my environmental management systems course at Ryerson University. You might classify it, for instance, on scope. Okay, so the issues and indicators could be organized around goals, issues, or domains. And domains, in this context, is where they're referring to something like the triple bottom line framework, the environment, economy, society framework. I'd say is probably by far the most widely used conceptual framework to help prompt the identification of issues and organize indicators of sustainable development. Potentially, we could organize it according to location, okay, or organizational level. And there may be some other methods. The pressure state response method, for example, is another fairly common one. But the point is that there's a number of different frameworks out there that we can use. But the important thing is that we have something, right, to help get us going, right, to basically give us all a common point of reference. And in large part, at least to me, that's what a conceptual framework is all about. Once you've done that, then you can start thinking about what are the key priority areas that we need to address. And this is probably going to be an iterative process. This is likely a step where you want to make sure that you have a fairly broad representation of stakeholders. And again, who you specifically involve is going to vary from context to context, but you want to make sure that you've given some thought to who those people are going to be. You can see here that I've got one example set of key indicators, and this is from or key issues, pardon me. This is from a project I did with an electric utility a few years ago. Not to say that this is, the best example of key issues, but it gives you one point of reference. Basically what we did in that context is we used the triple bottom line framework to help prompt the identification of issues, and you can see that ultimately those issues were organized around 3 key themes, and we had basically 8 key issues that this organization decided to address. To get to those 8 key issues was actually quite a lengthy process. We started off with well over 100 issues, and then through facilitation, we helped eliminate redundancies and then basically identify the key things that we really needed to focus on. Much like with the indicators themselves, there are all kinds of example sets of key issues in the literature. Okay? So again, you could be focusing on national, on regional, organizational level sustainable development indicators. And if you need a starting point, again, it makes sense to at least start and see, perhaps what are organizations in a similar sector doing, or if you're developing community indicators, maybe you want to start just to get some ideas, or look at some point, maybe not at the beginning, but at some point, you want to look and see maybe what others have done to see if these are issues that may make sense in your particular context. Once we've got the issues, a common step in indicator development schemes is to develop indicator selection criteria. And certainly these criteria are at the discretion of those involved. Again, there's all kinds of sets of criteria that have been published, and in fact, this was probably one of the main areas of academic research in the early days of sustainable development indicators. So, 15 years ago or so, you go back, you could find all kinds of examples in the literature and some rather lengthy lists. Right? It's not uncommon to have a list of 20 criteria, for example, in the academic literature. You can see here that I've provided just a few samples. Okay, it's not to say that this is the best set of criteria, but this is one set that was used with the electric utility example that I provided earlier. You can see here that the In that context, we thought the indicators need to be understandable, actionable, so that in this particular case, that reasonable improvement was within the control of the utility. Credible, relevant, illustrative, provide linkages. And again, there's certainly other things that you could potentially add there. The indicator selection criteria might be supported by some supporting guidelines. One big one that I particularly like, but certainly up to the particular context, is that data doesn't necessarily need to be available, but measurement should be possible. There's different views on this. Sometimes people feel that you should only develop indicators when you actually have the data available. On the other side of things, maybe you take the ideal approach and you identify that theoretical set of indicators, and then go back and look at, okay, what data do we need to collect in order to implement this indicator, and then is it worth the effort and the expense to collect this information for the indicator. You can see I've got some other key tests here. Again, just some things to keep in mind when selecting indicators. Once we've gone to the trouble of identifying our conceptual framework, we've identified the key issues that we want to focus on, and we have some indicator selection criteria to help bridge that gap from the issues to the indicators. Typically, we'll start developing a draft system of indicators. Again, this is a process that's going to vary somewhat from case to case, okay? But this is one rather generic process. You might start off by developing a pool of indicators, and again, here you might want to draw on indicators that have previously been published. You might want to do some brainstorming with stakeholders, for instance. There's probably going to need to be some consolidation of that. If you sit down and brainstorm pretty quickly, you wind up with a fairly extensive list of indicators, and probably need to go back and think about how we can consolidate those and then get into finalizing indicators. As you're going through a process like this, of course, there's all kinds of things to keep in mind. And you can see that I've highlighted a few of these here. The distribution between generic and unique indicators, again, goes back to really those two broad approaches to creating indicators. If you're creating unique indicators, advantages could be the development of unique competencies. Potentially, the process of developing those indicators could lead to buy-in or a sense of ownership that'll be necessary to actually implement the indicators. So, there's trade-offs, okay, in using these generic versus unique indicators. Key dilemma is the number of indicators to include in the system. Generally, in the published literature, there'll be recommendations to keep the set of indicators relatively limited, and in general, I'd agree with that. That said, there may be organizations or entities out there that actually want a larger set of indicators for whatever reason. In the corporate world, for example, they may be under pressure to demonstrate that they're considering these issues, and one way to do that is to incorporate an indicator into the system. That said, if you start getting above 40 or something like that, you need to give serious consideration to how you're going to structure those indicators and wind up presenting them. The risk, of course, in the long list of indicators is that you overwhelm people with information, or important things may just get lost in the sea of information that you've provided. Probably want to think about, as we were discussing a little bit earlier on, the relationship between the indicators to each other. I also want to think about the relationship of the indicators to existing infrastructure, where they might fit in existing decision-making processes, for example, or existing external reporting processes. Again, you need to think about who's going to be using these things, and that's really something that needs to be done throughout the entire process. Sometimes that'll get lost, again, in the rush to develop indicators. You may forget about how these things are actually going to be used in practice, and I think that's probably the key guideline you want to keep in mind throughout the entire process. And the last one is the appropriateness of developing a composite index. There's a lot of differing views on whether a composite index should be created. When I say composite index, what I'm referring to basically is where you take more than one indicator and you combine that information to get to one number. Right? Of course, in order to do that, you're probably going to have to make a lot of assumptions. You're probably winding up adding apples and oranges, which means you have to get into normalization processes. You may want to get into weighting processes, and there's a lot of judgment that goes into that. One of the big drawbacks of creating a composite index, of course, is if you go to the one number, it may mask the fact that there are problems in individual indicators. So that's one common criticism. On the plus side, sometimes people say that getting this one number is a good way to capture people's attention. And when you're dealing with particularly large sets of indicators, it may be difficult to get a sense of the overall picture looking at them individually. So again, there's dissenting views on whether you should create a composite index. So you might want to consider whether it makes sense in your particular context. Finally, the last piece is focused on review. And again, I think it's always useful to take that step back once you have your draft system of indicators. And you know, these are 3 key tests. It's not to say that they're the only ones, but I think some useful things to think about. Have we missed anything? Right? Even if you have a large set of indicators, who knows? Maybe you haven't adequately addressed one of the key issues that you'd identified. Is there any redundancy? And you know, initially that's certainly possible. Okay, and then the key question again for me is: are all these proposed indicators actually going to be used, and how? And again, it's very easy to get caught up in developing those long lists of indicators because it's easy to write down an indicator, and maybe you have the data. But the question is, how is that actually going to be used? With that, I think I'll turn it over to Maureen, who's going to continue our discussion talking about developing indicators.
And this is going to lead right up to the next discussion, which is what we really want to spend most of the rest of the time on, is having you think about one of those issue areas, and you can break off, you know, do one issue area per table, or maybe break off into different tables if you feel like there's different things you want to work on. But talking about, for that particular issue area, what would be a good system level indicator, and what would be some other ones. This gets to what I think is a really key issue with sustainability indicators and indicators in general. We tend to say, well, we have to have the indicator. And so we come up with an indicator like greenhouse gas emissions. And that's really nice. But who's in charge? You know, I was speaking to the sustainability manager for Kansas City, Missouri, and he said, you know, from within the boundaries of the city of Kansas City, the municipality itself is responsible for 3% of the greenhouse gases. So the mayor says, we're going to go carbon neutral. Who cares? 3% doesn't get you anything. Okay, so we need to think about what's the big picture, but who's really doing something about it, and who needs to do something about it. And to do that, you need to have 2 levels of indicator. We need to have these system level indicators that tell us what's the long-term big picture. But you also have to have organizational or program level indicators that say, what are we doing right now, this month, this year? What can we report on in a short term that tells us whether or not we're making that long-term progress? We say we have to reduce greenhouse gases by 80% by the year 2050. And if we keep saying, oh yeah, there's the long-term goal, well, what if in 2048 we've reduced it by 2%, so we've got the balloon mortgage to pay off in 2 years? We need to think about how are we making progress every year? So we need that big picture. It's not all under one organization's control. It's often implied in the goals of organizations, but it's not something they actually control. And then what are the program level indicators? What are the things that different individuals and organizations are doing? You know, and this is sort of the picture. You've got the municipal government. Kansas City is doing some things, but in fact, they have their community members. They have businesses. They have nonprofit organizations. They've got residences. And then, you know, Kansas City is part of a large 9-county area with a regional government. And so you've got all those different communities. And it's not like the mayor of Kansas City can say, okay, everybody, when you get to our borders, get out of your cars and start walking. You know, so there's a regional system that we need to work within. So what we need to do is think about what are the big picture system level indicators, and then for different organizations, what I call the key actors, what are the indicators they can be using to say, here's what we're doing and we can report out on it. So here's an example from the project that I worked on in the Mid-America Regional Council of Governments, Mark, was working on trying to define how they could become America's green region. And so one of the indicators they came up with was greenhouse gas emissions. They said, okay, the regional greenhouse gas emissions is going to be our system level indicator. But now what do we measure on an organizational basis? Well, obviously Mark, the Council of Government, doesn't really control how much greenhouse gases people are putting out. But what they can measure is how many of the municipalities have actually signed on to the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. how many of them actually completed an emissions inventory, and how much energy or emissions are they putting out. The municipalities can be looking at theirs, but the Chamber of Commerce is also involved here. How many businesses in the region have done an audit and are reporting on their progress, or have signed on to some climate protection program? The utilities can be involved in that. So you need to say what's the issue, and then for that issue, who are the key actors, and how can we go about measuring progress there? And it's not just about saying we're going to measure their progress. They've got to be part of it. Make sure that they're going to be engaged in the process. So here's another example, also from the Kansas City region. They were looking at what they call a green infrastructure. And this is not green roofs or whether you have swales. This is all of the natural areas, including habitat, biodiversity areas. So they said their system level indicator was going to be how much of our region is permeable, because the amount of permeable land has an effect on your water quality. They identified this as something that had a lot of different connections. So they said, okay, for the Council of Governments, we're going to look at how much of the Metro Green Plan has been actually completed. The municipalities are saying, well, we're going to start looking at how much of our development projects are permitted that include land conservation, or how much of our open space is totally protected. Where it's done at the developer level, we get them to think about, okay, we're going to develop this area, but how much of it are we going to leave as natural area? So you've got the big picture indicator, and then for individual key actors within that issue area, you say, how do we measure progress on a short-term, quarterly, yearly basis?
Did you also consider looking at indicators for carrying capacity? Like all of these seem to be kind of development and project related indicators, but in terms of carrying capacity of the natural environment, have you considered those in terms of what's available in any given area or geographic area and or municipality?
The carrying capacity indicators are the ones at the top level. And yes, some of the ones below that can speak to it. But in fact, it's a lot of these things are regional issues. So there's studies that say that if you have more than 20% of your land area that's impervious, you're going to have degraded water quality. Okay, so does that mean that every municipality can have 19% impervious surfaces? Well, here you've got the city of Toronto, but then you go farther out, you get 50 miles out. Do you want those municipalities also to be 19%? This is one of those issues where you can't say what the absolute number is. It's a social and political discussion that you have to have, but just having that indicator there starts the discussion.
Well, that may well vary from one municipality to another.
But in Connecticut, there's a rule about, or there's this statement that the state itself is going to have 11% land conserved, and so people will call the Department of Environmental Protection and say, okay, so we've got to have 11%, right? Well, some of those really rural areas should probably have 50%, 60%, whereas the downtown municipal area is not going to have even 11% open space, perhaps. So you need to think about it in the context.
If I can just add to that, I think the carrying capacity question is very important, and I think we need to realize that in some cases it's very hard to compute. We simply don't know because science doesn't know. So which doesn't mean that we don't need to have the discussion. But I think we also need to realize that in cases where we suspect there's a critical threshold and we don't know where it is, that we are actually running an experiment. So I think there's a link for me between this question of critical thresholds and carrying capacity and the uncertainty related to that and the precautionary principle or precautionary approach. If you don't know where that threshold is, but you have a very strong suspicion it's there, and the consequences of failing are significant, try to get close. So,
Yeah, and if you go back to the, let's go backwards here. Okay, so here, and this is the carrying capacity indicator. Now, we don't know that the 1990 level is at the carrying capacity, but it's at least saying, you know, where we are now is important. So we've got to reduce it something. And so then you're going to have more discussion about what really is the carrying capacity level. But first we have to get people to realize that there are limits. And that's one of the biggest issues here. People refuse to accept that there are limits. And so just having an indicator that says that there is a limit, even if we're not sure what it is.
We're past our time, and I've noticed a couple people have been popping their heads in here, so they probably want us to clear the room. But I'd like to thank you very much for attending this session, and also the conference in general. I think this was an interesting session, and a lot of interesting issues discussed, and some things maybe for all of us to think about as you know, we head to the reception later on. So once again, thanks very much. I know that Maureen had some brochures for the Community Indicators Consortium, and certainly I'd encourage you to pick some of those up. I don't know if Maureen wants to say a few words on that, or just get the brochure, right? And if you have questions, please follow up with Maureen. But once again, thanks very much, and have a good night, and we'll see you all tomorrow probably.